Good morning and welcome to the TK show on our channel. And I think this is our second show for the year. I would like to thank you just for staying tuned. Today's guest, taking it a bit of a different trajectory altogether, still within the realm of public policy, but I think a more nuanced look at public policy. We'd like to welcome Bheki Mahlobo. Bheki, welcome to TK show.
Hi, TK. Thank you so much for having me on. I'm looking forward to the conversation that we're going to have, man.
Cool stuff, man. Bheki, I think a lot of people, I know you caught my attention last year when you were, I think, on one of those news outlets, just basically giving a breakdown of what's happening in relation to risk analysis. And that's what I think we want to really cover. Because I think if you've worked in the private sector, you kind of have an idea what risk is about. But it's actually quite a new field, I think, to most general South Africans. But before maybe we get to that, just maybe a bit about yourself. You know, what drives the man, Bheki? Where do you come from? And yeah, how did you get into the field that you're in?
Yeah, I think that's actually like a really good starting point. Basically grew up in Johannesburg all my life, but I do have family in the Eastern Cape from my mother's side. So every June and December, as I was growing up, I'd go and visit Ekaya, El Papas, which is a rural area in Eastern Cape, gravel road, basically no service delivery, internet connection, good luck with that.
Jeez.
Yeah, but what I loved about it is that my family was there, as well as a few community members were there that I know of, friends and mates, a few friends from there as well. Really nice people, really welcoming to me and so forth. Even though I was like a bit of a city boy, still am. But yeah, predominantly my life has been around Johannesburg, few years in Pretoria as well, but mostly here in Johannesburg. And that also led me to where I currently am. So I currently work for the Center for Risk Analysis. I'm a senior analyst and as well as an economist, right? So when people say like, what is an economist? At first, I found it quite uncomfortable for people to refer me as an economist because I was still trying to identify what exactly is an economist. And I think many economists as well, even to this day, don't really know what it means to be an economist, or also trying to find out what exactly it means being an economist. But I really thought I came up with an answer, and that answer is that being an economist means that you try to find unique ways to view risks and understand social economic indicators, as well as how those impact the daily lives of people, right? As well as looking at it across each respective economy, right? So where I'm working at the Center for Risk Analysis, I'm primarily involved with policy analysis as well as policy risks. In other words, how does the policy implemented by the ruling government impact the daily lives of ordinary South Africans? So that's what I do majority of the time at the Center for Risk Analysis, but not only in South Africa, but we also look at now more globally as well, looking at countries such as the United States, as well as the European area and so forth, given what has happened over the past few months.
Oh, that's actually good. It's interesting that you'd mentioned the United States because I think it was always a rule of thumb that risk is associated with developing countries, and the countries that are well off, like the US, there's no need for risk. So
there's a lot of risk there. Yeah.
So I think that's, and your background, I think I like the way you've been able to gel just where you come from and how you got into this field. Does it give you maybe a bit of a nuanced interpretation of your field, understanding that, like you said, your understanding of how policy works out in places such as rural Eastern Cape and the like, that's sort of, you kind of understand it more than the textbook?
Yeah, for sure. There are many differences that I see from Eastern Cape, rural Eastern Cape, as well as the city Johannesburg. Like I touched on it a little bit there in terms of service delivery, basically almost being non-existent. It's not to say there's no service delivery, there is electricity, but Eastern Cape, where I'm from, got the power only in 2007, at that time when majority of the country was like already lit. And there are actually a few areas as well in Eastern Cape that don't have power, electricity, and so forth. So I've seen those problems firsthand while growing up, such as well, like the nearest town. It's supposed to take if you have a car with proper roads, it's supposed to take about 20 minutes, but it ends up taking like an hour due to the gravel roads and how the roads are badly maintained. As well as the schools are not up to par compared to other schools that I've had the great privilege of going to, for example, my high school years. Some schools don't have proper roofing. Most famous cases over the years has been that of pit toilets, which are prevalent in all schools, most schools in the Eastern Cape. So I think it's also in that environment where my questions started to arise. I started asking questions like, why is the Eastern Cape like this compared to other areas that I grew up in, for example, compared to if I were to go to Cape Town as well, why is there so much differences between these two provinces or three provinces as well? And then, yeah, it's those questions that led me to the CRA. What I appreciate about the CRA is that we are unfiltered in when it comes to our analysis, and that does ruffle a lot of feathers, be it government departments or be it as well as that of businesses, for example. But our analysis is really drawn on sound logic as to we look at what would a particular policy, the result of a policy be on an ordinary South African. If I were to draw down the essential point of our work is to analyze how does the average South African get impacted as well as that of the average business as well.
No, I think that's a nice way to put it. And maybe I guess we can get to more of the graph now of just your reading of South Africa or South African government's policy, as in how much do they factor in risk? I mean, one of my critiques I've always had is I think I'm sure you've recently seen the ANC has released their policy documents, and it's nice discussions. I mean, no one would disagree with many of the facts they put down, but we always ask, but have you factored in that things can go wrong? You know, so how much of risk, just the idea of risk, do you think they put into policy making?
Yeah, I think a really good starting point when it comes to the ruling government is to actually look at them over the past 28 years, right? Since the start of democracy, right? Since as South Africa emerged from the evils of the apartheid regime and democracy was implemented in the country, we saw the early ANC, the early administration of the ANC during democracy under the leadership of Nelson Mandela and Thabo Mbeki. Now, those two leaders followed policies which I would consider pragmatic, right? These were gear policies. Now, this is something that most analysts don't recognize today and is actually not spoken about enough. As during the policies implemented by those two previous administrations, so the country grew at GDP levels of about 3 to 5%. For example, between 2004 until 2007. Service delivery, for example, increased. Such indicators such as electricity used for cooking, housing, water, those indicators increased by 200% from 1994 until 2007. Employment numbers doubled as well amongst all racial categories, including that of the Black population, which was barred from employment before 1994, if you look at labor participation rates as well as the number of people employed. So a lot of analysts tend to dismiss those early successes of the ANC. However, I tend to emphasize them because it is a benchmark of how far have we declined or stagnated since that point. So subsequent after Thabo Mbeki, GDP performance in the country then stagnated. This was the transition of Jacob Zuma as well as that of Cyril Ramaphosa, right? In those years, we saw, unfortunately, policies that have been hostile to economic growth, for example, that haven't increased economic performance over the past 10 years. In fact, we struggled to surpass 2% GDP over the past 10 years, and that has led to employment numbers to now dip. In fact, if you look at our employment figures to date, we have about 14.5 million South Africans employed. That's lower than 2019 levels at about 16 million. So about 1.9 million South Africans short jobless, and they are now added to the unemployment category. And those levels are about the same level when Thabo Mbeki left office in 2008. And that's really reflective of the policies that have been enacted over the past years. And those policies have been a risk to millions of South Africans. Also looking at the youth unemployment rate, which is now close to 80%, for example. And that carries significant risks as well. So
All right.
when you, sorry.
No, because I was just going to say, would you mind just elaborating some of these policies? Because I've got
Yes.
two key questions relating to, maybe you can also kind of put that in the 2007-2008 world financial crisis.
Yes.
And also COVID, because that's also one of the arguments that has always been used, that no, we have to factor in. So if you can maybe elaborate on the policies and maybe just touch on these two external factors.
Of course. Yeah, of course, the financial crisis as well as the pandemic had a severe impact on the South African economy, not only in South Africa, but as well as in other countries around the world, for example. We saw massive unemployment levels in the United States as well, where unemployment in the US jumped from about 3.5% to 11% during the pandemic. This was reflective from the developed world as well as emerging markets, which South Africa was then also negatively impacted, right? Now, unfortunately, South Africa entered the pandemic already on a recession, firstly, and already on high unemployment rates. Our unemployment rate under the official definition was at 29% when we went into the pandemic, the 2020 pandemic. A worrying trend with South Africa, and this is why South Africa is then set apart from the rest of the world, is that when you're looking at our unemployment levels, for example, right, our unemployment levels have not recovered to pre-pandemic levels, which is not what we see in other countries. Look at Brazil, look at Argentina, look at Turkey. I'm pointing at these countries because these are not developed countries. These countries have recovered their unemployment levels, to some of them to the point where they're better before even the pandemic. Also, with the United States, we've seen a recovery in their unemployment numbers from 11% to just below 4% now. Whereas South Africa's unemployment levels is ticking up and up and up, where our official unemployment rate is about 35%, the highest in G20 countries, as well as the highest compared to 183 countries. South Africa has the highest unemployment levels compared to other democracies around the country. And I think that is really reflective of example, when you're looking at rigid labor policies. An example of this that I'll firstly speak about is that of the minimum wages. Right? What people tend to not often understand is that minimum wages unfortunately negatively impacts the youth in the country, where it makes labor more expensive, particularly for new recruitants. These are people that haven't had work experience, for example, fresh out of university or fresh out of high school. So they don't have the academic backdrop or well as the experience of them to earn a higher wage. So therefore, they then tend to work for low wages and upskill themselves through experience and find themselves working in such positions such as managers. Now, unfortunately, once you start making the gate of entry more expensive, you make those walls and gates very high, you therefore restrict new employment, primarily the youth, from getting those jobs, and unfortunately results in a massive level of youth unemployment rates in the country. And that's exactly what we're seeing here. Not only that from a youth perspective, but also overall the labor market, which has been hampered by policies such as that of now currently the amendment to the Employment Equity Act that would give enormous powers to the labor minister to therefore set racial quotas by industry. And our numbers on this is that this will actually push unemployment beyond the 50% under the expanded definition. So these are the policies that have been detrimental to the labor markets in the country, and what sets South Africa apart from other countries, which these countries are not following the policies that South Africa is implementing.
It's good that you start there, because I always want to unpack this idea that, because I think it's when people say rigid, I think they don't always explain it fully, like you're saying, because I think some people touch on, look, the ability to hire and fire people as you will, forgetting obviously there's a context to it. But maybe if you could just maybe expand on what you said about, because I like the way you actually put it, that let's compare, because I think sometimes we have this, maybe it's a government thing, or maybe it's a fault of analysts. We always like comparing, what's the EU doing, forgetting that we're nowhere near where the EU and America is. If you could just maybe, what are our, let's say, counterparts doing differently in relation to, let's say, the employment policies vis-a-vis us? As in, what should we actually be doing? Should we be, let's be frank, should we be more loose saying this in private sector? If you find TK is doing TK things, you can fire him, without having to follow due process. Minimum wage, let's relax that a bit. What are our counterparts doing differently to stimulate, I would say employment, firstly of, let's say, non-skilled, as in people who haven't gone to varsity, and which is a majority of South Africans. And two, those that have gone to varsity, what are they doing differently to actually create these industries and allow for employment?
Yeah, that's a very good question. And there are multiple variables with this, but let's touch on them one at a time. For example, the first one, directly added, which is what you touched on, being that of minimum wages. The first example of this is that of minimum wages, right? What we see in other countries is that their minimum wages are not expensive as that of South Africa. In other words, they do not price labor as expensively as South Africa. That's the first thing that we see when comparing other emerging markets. This is not to say that they do not have some form of assistance for low income wages. It's just that these countries are not expensively priced in as what South Africa is, for example. It's not putting much of a burden on businesses, for example. And unfortunately, that has also resulted in South Africa being on the negative side with youth unemployment levels. The first one is that of skills development. The education system in South Africa does not properly equip young South Africans with the skills needed to be employed in the labor market. An indication of this is looking at our matric pass mark. Now, the Department of Education has stated that for the year 2021, the pass rate has been about 76%. However, if you were to look at the grade 1 class of 2010, there were about 1.1 million pupils enrolled in grade 1 in 2010. You follow them all the way until they've passed the matric exams, that number drops to about 500,000 South Africans that have passed their grade 12s from the original grade 1. So that's already 500,000 pupils that have dropped out of high school already. Follow them until they've passed with a bachelor's pass mark. That's about 250,000 now. And then only about 60,000 young South Africans pass mathematics with the 50% mark and above, right? That's 60,000 out of the original 1.1 million pupils enrolled in grade 10. That's a pass mark of about 5%. That's essentially the pass mark that South Africa has, compared to the 76% published by the Department of Education. Now, that's a massive failure, and it's massive dropout levels, for example. Now, why do I like to emphasize the mathematics pass mark of 50% and above? Well, in order for a pupil to enroll into university, they would need a math pass mark of 50% and above. Once pupils have gotten that university qualification, their chances of being employed sits at about 75% when looking at labor absorption levels, right? These levels are compared to what we see in developed markets, such as that of the United States, such as that of Germany. So we can therefore see once pupils have then enrolled into university, gotten their qualifications, they stand higher chances of being employed. And unfortunately, a majority of young people in the country are not passing through that phase. And it really is reflective of the poor standards that our education system is in. But another point that I'd like to touch on there is not only from the education perspective, right? Education is indeed important, but you can also learn by doing work on the job. This is something that I've also seen myself. For example, as I'm doing more of the task, I'm learning new ways, I'm learning a new skill, and through repetition, for example. And unfortunately, once you bar millions of South Africans from that, therefore they cannot upskill themselves through employment, and unfortunately face little prospects of getting employed in future. So those are the factors that differentiate South Africa compared to other emerging markets.
Okay, no, that's actually a good one, and maybe leads me to I think the ones you've spoken about, the bigger drop-off rate, not the ones that are in the 60 is. So the type of economy we need then, it would seem to me that, look, as I know they always punt the German one, which I haven't lived there, it does make sense, whether you're a plumber or not. But what would we need to actually be able to say, listen, how do we get more artisans out of this education system? What do we need to change so that, we can kind of absorb, look, yes, the risk of our education system, but over time, being allowing people, like you say, to grow in whatever field of work, not necessarily having been to varsity. What do we need to change there within the economy? Maybe speak to the private sector.
The first one is definitely our labor regulations. We need to make it more easier for businesses to hire South Africans, even if it is that of low income wages, right? And it's through that process. The thing with policymakers in the country that they miss is that they look at low income wages and they say that workers are being exploited. And I'm not saying that we should not have regulations that protect workers. Those are definitely important. However, our policies make it extremely expensive as well as burdensome for businesses to hire individuals for low income wages. What needs to happen is that we need to create the incentive for businesses to hire young individuals as well as that to hire individuals for low income wages. In that you could then therefore push these millions of South Africans that have been barred from employment to therefore being employed. And this will predominantly be that of low income wages, for example. But then through the number of years that they get experience, they can therefore upskill themselves and therefore push themselves to a higher standard of living as well as higher positions in future. This is what happens with majority of people. As they start working, they start off with a low income. As they gain that level of experience, therefore move into other positions as well as that of other sectors as well. Unfortunately, if we do not solve that from a labor regulatory perspective, then these young South Africans, unfortunately, would not have that ability to upskill themselves.
So this is something within the domain of what government can do.
Exactly. That is like, if that is something in which that is within the domain that the government can do. The education perspective is also important. However, it will take a while for those numbers to therefore feed into the labor market. What can be done with the signature of a pen is to reduce the burdensome of low incomes to incentivize businesses to therefore hire these young South Africans. That can be done.
No, that's actually quite good, because I think it's always important that we sort of, because I know, as I said, the problem sometimes is discussions, people explain the problem, but they never do what you're doing now, which is to say, listen, what is in the domain of government to do, what can be done immediately, but also, like you're saying, what will take a longer term to get done, which is reform of the education system. So I think it was good that you put it like that. And then maybe just, if we can maybe
just to touch on the education, if you don't mind.
Yeah.
I think this is also goes to the solutions that can be done with education. So I would like to use an example of myself, right? And I really hate using anecdotal experience, but I think it is relevant in certain points. So I went to this really good school called Boksburg High in the East Rand. Now, the school was about 25 kilometers from where I stayed at the time, Sprayed View. And the nearest school from us was like Leondale. And if you can recall, at that time, there was like feeding zones. So schools would therefore reject you. I think if you were beyond, I believe it was 20 kilometers, then they would say you're too far from the school in order for you to be enrolled in the school. So I was about 25 Ks away. And there was a little bit of disagreement between my mother as well as the principal, but eventually my mother, a strong woman, managed to fight my way as well as my sister's way in order for us to enroll into the school, right? Now, the nearest school was that of Leondale High. Do you know Leondale High?
No, the name is familiar, but
okay. So the name is familiar because 3 weeks ago, Leondale High was on the news because there was a footage of students smoking marijuana on 420. More than 30 school pupils smoking marijuana in a field. I think it was a field or so. And my mother, 10 years ago, saw that the school is not up to par to educate me as well as my sister, and took it upon herself to therefore send us 25 Ks away from home to a good school, and that was Boksburg High. So the point that I'm trying to make, and when it comes to education and when it comes to poor parents, is that the government should allow parents to choose the schools in which they would like to send their pupils. This can be done through a voucher system. In other words, you give parents a voucher, a school voucher. We spend about more than 300 billion in education. So you break that up, give it to poor households and say, hey, here's a voucher. You have the choice of sending your school to Leondale High, or you have the choice of sending your son, daughter to Boxback High, and you tend that most parents would send their kids to a better performing school, and therefore the bad schools are likely on Dale High, would therefore close down.
So it's almost but like a competition within this SMME market for
Exactly, it's a
schools.
competition for education, which is definitely what's needed in the education system.
So basically, perform, because I think what's that other country? Is it Estonia does, I think, uses something similar to that, where if you're a good school.
Yeah, exactly. And I think also in the US, they call them charter schools as well.
Yes.
And then also I believe in certain districts in India as well, also implements that as well.
All right. So how do you think that would play out though in South Africa? Let's say we all rush to one school. Are you saying that, are there enough good schools, do you think, for?
Yes. Yeah, I do believe so. I believe what would happen is that there are already enough good schools in the country in order for pupils to enroll. But not only that, but through competition, you then also start to see the building of new schools that would like to compete with those other good schools, for example. And perhaps even the bad schools would then start to pick up their own socks, you know. I believe, for example, if there was more accountability in schools like Leondale, if there was more accountability in schools that are still in the Eastern Cape, where bad teachers that do not teach, teachers that are mostly absent from classes, not teaching school pupils, should therefore be fired and replaced with good teachers, be replaced with good management, a good principal, then you'd start to see those bad schools therefore becoming good schools, for example. So I believe that's what could happen when a policy such as the voucher system is implemented.
But the starting point is, as you said, giving parents the ability to make a choice from an already existing funding from government.
Exactly. Already existing funding from government. All that needs to happen now is just give parents the ability of choice to send the children to a good school. Already, I mean, we spend about 20% of expenditure on education. It's the most expensive line item on the budget. So therefore, what I'm just saying, within the constraints of government, just break up the expenditure that we spend on education, give it to parents, and parents make the best decision for their children.
Okay. No, I think that yeah, it's something I think which does need to be. I think we're at the stage where we literally have to explore everything. So why not this? I think.
Yeah, exactly.
No, but I think I like that. It's maybe if I could ask you, maybe before we just move outside of South Africa, just your 3 things which keep you up at night from a risk perspective relating to South Africa, which I think maybe you probably give us 2 which most people would know, maybe something, and maybe the third one, something we're not really thinking about, which you think, look, this is going to hit us. We're just asleep at the wheel at the moment.
Yeah, so I've already touched on the lack of improvement of social economic standing here in South Africa, where you have like 12.5 million South Africans unemployed. What is causing me to have more of a concern this year is what's happening now in regards to consumer prices. This year has been quite a hit on households in regards to fuel prices, largely due to the conflict between Russia and Ukraine, but as well as that of consumer prices within the country, within the borders of the country. Last week, SADC published the inflation number of about 5.9%, which is the second time that it has been at that level. However, if you look at the individual food items, such as oil for cooking, that has increased by 21% year on year, April of this year compared to April of last year. If you look at transportation, that has increased by 15% year on year. And that negatively impacts poor households, already in which those 12.5 million South Africans have been unemployed. Another concerning point for me is when looking at the duration of unemployment in the country. So SADC also has this category where it tries to gauge how long has a particular South African been unemployed. And unfortunately, that number sits at 80% of the current unemployed people in South Africa have been without a job for a year and more, and only 20% have been in short-term unemployment. That sets huge levels of risk for for an increase in violent protests, which is what we see. It has become a common theme in the country to see violent protests occurring in the country. And so once you take an environment where you start to see basic staples increasing beyond the level in which households can afford, I do see a situation where we could therefore see massive scales of protests, massive scales of civil unrest, maybe perhaps even greater than that of what we saw last year in July.
That's crazy, man.
Yeah.
Because I always wanted to ask, from your perspective, guys who study risk and what's associated with it. Look, I always say you should not, because in scenarios we say there's more than the bad case scenario. There's
Right.
a multitude of things that happen, but just maybe walk us through. Let's say we continue with this trajectory where voter apathy, because I think that's one of the things which we're seeing, where people are like, you know what, the system doesn't care about me, I won't care about the system. We are unable, like you say, to generate the type of employment we need in the system. Give us, maybe just walk us through what this looks like in 3 or 5 years' time. Or maybe even use a country example to say this is now what we look like.
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. For this question, if you don't mind, I will recall a conversation I had with it was a Bolt driver. I believe like Bolt drivers are by far the best analysts ever. They're even better than me actually.
These guys are good.
So through this conversation I had with him, he was saying that I think it was in regards to the building of buildings in Sandton, and he has friends and family members that would build these buildings in Sandton and then go away to their residential areas, be it Deep Slough, be it Soweto, or be it other areas around here, Alex, for example, around Sandton, or that of Midrand. And he was saying that it's unfair. It's unfair that we're the ones that build these buildings, but therefore we're not the ones also receiving the benefits of employment within these buildings, right? And I think that is really a dangerous thing that could happen, where you start to see an increase in economic exclusions amongst the disadvantaged in the country. And when I say disadvantaged, I mean particularly the people that are unemployed, that have low income. So this applies to all racial categories in the country. I think what could happen if we continue where we currently are, you're going to see those economic exclusions therefore intensify, such as that of, you might start to see an increase in xenophobic attacks, for example. I mentioned violent protests, for example, as well, to the point where the police will be unable to mitigate that, which is an example that of July unrest, in which in certain cases, news anchors were there even before the police, and people were stealing right in front of the police, and they couldn't control that situation. So the dire state in which South Africa could go in is that you will start to see massive scale of social unrest, to the point where it would be close to no law and order. I think that's hyperbolic to say at the present, but it would get to a point where the police essentially cannot do much about it. That's the situation that I see us going if we continue in this trajectory. But I wouldn't say that. A point that I want to emphasize here is that is a scenario that people should prepare themselves. Ordinary South Africans should prepare themselves, as well as that of ordinary businesses to prepare themselves for. However, I think we should also look at another scenario where that might not happen, for example, right? An example of this came last year in the 2021 November local elections. For the first time, the ANC dipping below 50% since 1994. I think that was quite telling. It was quite telling because millions of South Africans were voicing that you're not delivering on service delivery. You're not delivering when it comes to my job. Of course, those were local elections, so therefore they're more for local matters. But I do believe that millions of South Africans also losing their jobs also had an impact on that. So I think it was also South Africans emphasizing their frustrations, voicing out their frustrations towards the ruling government and saying, hey, you're not delivering on a better life for all, which is a slogan they had under Thabo Mbeki, which is now forgotten. So these are the issues that common South Africans are talking on, which is not being delivered by the ruling ANC, leading to the weaknesses when it comes to voter support. And I believe if they do not turn around the ship that we're heading in, then unfortunately it will result in a weakening of their support levels as well as that of their defeat in the upcoming 2024 national elections. So my sense of what might happen in the 2024 elections is that we may get a coalition of parties that would therefore implement these reforms that South Africa would need, and then South Africa would grow at the same level as what we see as other emerging markets. So those are the two scenarios that I think people should also, of course, there are many other variables to consider, but for the simplicity of it, those are the two things that I'm currently looking at.
All right. No, that's an interesting. We'll probably return to this when we go. We're just about to now do a tour de force again. Welcome to the TK show. My guest is Bheki Mahlobo from the Center for Risk Analysis. Right, if I captured that right, and we just and we're just really just going just into, looking at the issues of policy using, I think, the lens of risk analysis and economics for a change, because I think it's things which you always hear about in the news, but I don't think we spend enough time elaborating on it so that people, because I always say people, like you said, even Bolt drivers, taxi drivers, people have a good sense of where the country is going wrong. Exactly. The only issue I always find is that we don't give enough oxygen. We're very quick to go to issues such as there's a 22 million rand pole that needs to be erected, and that takes the oxygen in the room. But Bheki, it's good that you maybe touched on that. Let's maybe move across again. It's still South Africa focused, but SADC, it used to be one of the more stable regions across the continent, but we've seen in Mozambique that there's a few people who decided now that they want to stop commerce in people's lives. There's Botswana, which was the model of stability, is having its own issues at the moment. Angola is having its own issues. But just maybe walk us through SADC. Where do we stand on that? And obviously, I think you touched a bit on it when I say how it does have an imposition on South Africa, and in terms of where we want to go. If you could just your highlights, maybe just on the region.
Yeah, so just the highlight of SADC, what we do see is that of political risk happening in the region. So last year we saw what happened, for example, in Mozambique with an increase in terrorism, as well as in the SADC region, for example. So we believe that's largely due to the increase in economic exclusions that happen in these regions, high unemployment levels, massive poverty levels, and so forth. And I think what is going to happen this year, as well as in the coming years, is that you're going to see an increase in political instability. And that's largely coming from a price perspective, a consumer price perspective, again, which I touched on South Africa. Due to the conflict between Russia and Ukraine, such things such as wheat and corn are at all-time highs. Now, unfortunately, once you have an environment of an increase in consumer prices, as well as low-income countries such as SADC region countries, that then festers, unfortunately, and fertilizes an environment for great political instability in these regions. And this is something that we constantly monitoring at the CRA, where you could also start to see an increase in terrorism, for example. So that would be the main concern that I have with SADC regions, given this inflationary backdrop that we're currently in.
And maybe just on it, because I think it's good that you picked up wheat. I mean, I'm sure having stayed in the Eastern Cape, I think most research says if we actually had a proper agricultural system which was working, we would not need to be a wheat importer, net importer. We could actually be an exporter. How is it that SADC cannot literally be a food stable region? I mean, if you look at Zimbabwe, yes, we know the history. Mozambique, I mean, there's enough fertile land for the region to be food secure. How is it that we're not? Like I always say, you can do the most complex and most stupid of things, but the stomach should dictate that. Let me at least make sure that after my stupidity, I can go home and eat. How is it that we're not able to get that right in the region?
Yeah, exactly. That's a very good question. And I think it comes to one of the fundamentals that even South Africa is purposely weakening by the ruling government, and that is that of property rights in the SADC region. Property rights are extremely important and are one of the fundamental pillars of a successful economy. Now, what we see in SADC regions, some of the sub-Saharan African countries and so forth, is the dilution and weakening of property rights, where, for example, farmers do not have the adequate property rights in order for them to reinvest in farms as well as to sell that produce towards their respective economies as well as overseas, for example. If I may pull an example of South Africa. I know we're talking about SADC, but I also think this is also quite relevant, is that what's happening in the mining sector, for example, which I believe is a ripe example of what's happening with property rights in South Africa, is also reflective in other African countries. Last week, the Minister of Energy, Gwede Mantashe, said that he's going to pull the mining rights of Sibanye-Stillwater if Sibanye-Stillwater does not manage the strikes that they see in their operations. Now, due to the mineral rights in the country, the energy minister has enormous power to pull mineral rights from a mining company if that mining company is not continually operating as well as meeting the obligations set by the Minister of Energy. Now, unfortunately, if you have a situation in which a minister could take away your mining rights, literally a signature of a pen without having any form of disagreement, without having any form of checks, therefore that dilutes property rights in the country. And that is why expropriation without compensation is fundamentally a risk towards the South African economy. When it comes to Sibanye, as well as the mining sector in general, should be read as a warning towards mining companies of what's to come if we start to see these encroaches on mining rights by each mining sector. And I think it is quite telling because the mining sector has been the saving grace of South Africa since the commodity started in the third quarter of 2020. This is in fact what led to the finance minister to have something positive to speak about in his February budget this year. So what you see in these SADC regions, and unfortunately that has resulted in them not having high levels of economic performance, not having, for example, what you've mentioned, a high output when it comes to agricultural produce, is that it is the dilution of property rights that I see in these regions, unfortunately.
Yeah, no, I think we should actually call you back for that, because I think it's always been interesting to find out how then, within the context of risk analysis, do you, like the solutions going forward, because I think you probably understand that, yes, I think no one wants a Zimbabwe-style outcome, but I think people do want an equitable share of historical issues of land being sorted out. So I think you're right to say maybe we should be having more of a, I think, a conscious of the market, conscious of stability type of discussion, as opposed to what you're saying, where a minister overnight can say, "I feel," and then we have to suffer the consequences of their feelings. But I think just moving anything else, maybe before we leave the continent, which gives you sleepless nights, or
no, the only thing is like what I mentioned is the increase of terrorism in the continent. That is like predominantly the risk that I see occurring. Our numbers suggest that it's about 51% of surface area in Africa that's primarily at risk. So I need to recheck those numbers again and check what's happening in each of particular region. But that's the figures that I come to. So that's the main primary thing that's like making me think about Africa at present.
No, that's an interesting one, because I think terrorism, like you're saying, it does speak to the, like you said, the lack of what one would say, development at home.
Yeah.
Because I always say, if people have things to do, who really wants to go pick up a gun and fight?
Exactly.
I think we're going to move to one of our big export partners, which is the EU. And whatever that, well, I think we all know what's happening there. For a change, we can speak about them. But just your reading of is Brexit over? Or has Boris found something new he can chew on, which is the whole Ukraine thing, and people are forgetting So because I don't want to rush quickly to the Ukraine. I think I want to run through Europe. I think Macron has just had his election. I didn't see election. I didn't see whether he got his party got a majority in the Senate, because they've got that weird system of the presidential, then the party one. So just walk us through Europe. Do we still say the UK is part of Europe, or what do we call them? But they always confuse me.
So when it comes to Boris Johnson, I think like the conflict between Russia and Ukraine basically moved away eyes from him, because if you recall, he was in trouble due to the fact that he had COVID regulations that he himself was not following such as that what he was imposing on restaurants, which created a lot of disagreement within the UK.
Which is odd because in South Africa, we'd be like, it's normal, boss.
It's normal. I mean, we have like council members, like I think it was like within like the first 3 weeks of lockdown, popping champagne. Good, yeah. Amazing. Meeting up for family dinners while everyone else was banned from family gatherings and funerals and all that. So, yeah, but when it comes to Europe, particularly what's happening with Europe again, and this is really a repetitive theme, unfortunately, happening in all continents, is the repercussions between Russia and Ukraine. You know, the world has become increasingly interconnected, and you find any form of disruptions in one region would have an impact in another region. When it comes to Europe, they've been increasingly reliant on Russian gas over the past few years. And so when the conflict between Russia and Ukraine started on the 24th of February, we saw a massive uptick in fuel prices in Europe. I believe it was consumer prices for energy prices increased by 30% in that region. Producer inflation in that region is sitting at 30% as well. So you're seeing massive levels of inflation in Europe because of the conflict between Russia and Ukraine. And that is, of course, giving shifting attention to that, which is by far the most pressing concern. This has led many European countries to therefore start to look at Russia in a negative light, start to rely less on Russia when it comes to trade. So my favorite, a lot of people are going to hate me for this, but my favorite news channel is Russia Today, actually. You know, the state propaganda news site, but I loved it because, you know, they'll be really good at critiquing the US, not on themselves, but like they'll be critique the US, and I have to pop on a US news channel in order to critique Russia. That's how news channels have become nowadays.
Yeah.
But using that as an example, Russia Today has been banned in majority of countries today, including South Africa, for example. It's banned off YouTube. It's banned all over Europe. It's banned in the United States, I believe, as well. So the only way you could find them is if you go to the news channel. And I also do think that we will start to see these Russian businesses also facing the same type of banning if they do have political connections with Vladimir Putin or with the Russian government. So that is what's happening with the European Union. For example, Germany, when it came to the military spending, was not strong on military spending. But however, as soon as the conflict between Russia and Ukraine started, they doubled their military budget. So we're seeing this decoupling of the reliance on Russia as well as the reliance on Russian gas. So that's like really the driving theme of what's happening there in Europe.
No, that's just maybe before we leave you, just on that though, from a perspective of risk, how wise was it to go for almost like an Armageddon of taking Russia off SWIFT, taking them off this, as opposed to, because I mean, there's always a logic which says, you know, if you use your best bullets, what have you got left? Because at the moment, like you say, now that prices are going up, what leverage is there to say, listen, Putin, let's have a discussion? Because surely, you know, if you're in that position, you just become more stubborn to say, okay, listen, you put me in a worse hole, I'll put everyone in it. So just from a perspective of how, just the element of how risk is understood in politics, is it still, because I know we've moved past the idea of that man is rational, right? I think we can all agree that economics doesn't work, but just the idea of having to sometimes have cool heads and looking at this from a perspective of risk, how well do you think it was factored into from the side of Europe?
Yeah, so from the side of Europe as well as that of the United States, this has been a huge risk for them. On one point, you touched on SWIFT, for example, and I think other countries are now looking at the United States and saying, hey man, so you're telling me that you can ban or freeze my foreign reserves like that. And I believe a lot of countries will then have a distrust for the dollar and try to therefore settle transactions without the dollar as well as that in their own currencies. China is an example. India is also an example of this. So from a currency perspective in the United States, I think this has really started the doubts of the dollar or rather exacerbated the doubts of the US dollar, as well as the powers of the of the United States, for example. A risk perspective is that of inflation, unfortunately. Again, when looking at the fuel prices, this has also led to, in the United States, consumers being pessimistic in the United States when looking at consumer sentiment indicators, as well as polling data. Biden, the president of the United States, Joe Biden, is now at negative polling data, which has never been seen before in a US president in his first term, for example, or his first year now. And that's largely feeding off the high inflation levels that we're seeing in the US, now sitting at about 8%. But you have such things such as fertilizer at 30% negatively impacting farmers, as well as global supply chains being at elevated levels, as well as that of the conflict adding new pressures on global supply chains. That's a risk that both negatively impacts the United States as well as the European area, as well as Africa, for example. So those are the risks. That's what's happening between the different regions.
All right, and then I think as we jump to the other pond, which is the US, because they're going to be having their midterms, right, in November, if I'm not
mistaken. They're having the midterms in November, yeah.
So how does that work out though for Biden? As in, if just talking international risk, because usually I know by American trends that most presidents don't do well in the midterms.
Yeah.
But I think if you to lose this at the Senate and Congress, it creates a new element of quasi Trump comes back to life type of thing.
Yeah, exactly. I think Democrats in the United States will closely watch what's going to happen in the midterms. From what I've been seeing, a lot of analysts, and I think I'm also inclined to say this, that a lot of them will lose a lot of seats in the midterms. And that's predominantly what's happening firstly with consumer sentiment, but as well as that of what's happening in schools, for example. Democrats have really positioned themselves to be, unfortunately, to be in a weaker hand when it comes to schools. Predominantly what's happening with regards to critical race theory. Just a short note of what critical race theory is. This is essentially the belief that all forms of injustices in the United States, in some way, shape, or form, relates to systematic racism in the institutions of the United States. When it comes to education, it means that for such things as mathematics, Democrats have had this position that mathematics is racial, therefore there should be a different set of mathematics taught for white students. I know, it's crazy. I also laughed at this. There should be different maths taught for white students compared to black students, for example. Parents should not be involved in the school process of their children. And this is really like messed up voter support for the Democrats.
This is in America.
This is in America. This is in America. This is in America. But not only that, but also the fact that the economy is not doing well in the US, for example. We already had a contraction of about 1.4% in the first quarter of this year. Interest rates are being hiked in the US, meaning that it will be more expensive for households to service their debt as well as to acquire debt. We're seeing a decline in the stock markets, for example, so pensioners are probably not also happy as well. So there are all these factors that are contributing towards consumers to be more pessimistic. And unfortunately, that would result in Democrats being weaker in the midterms this year.
No, yeah.
And if I may also touch, I think it's also worth looking at where economic growth would lead in the US. Our call is that we are likely to see a recession in the US towards the end of this year or early next year, largely due to the interest rates being hiked, which would hamper economic activity in the US.
So hence we saw last week, I think our own governor started to raise interest rates, and this is going to become the norm.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I wouldn't move past down the border. We don't want to offend Trump and his folk as well. To say anything from South America or Australia before we go to China, because I think I just want to close off with Asia.
In terms of South America, I don't have much of a close eye on South America. I don't view it in detail as much as other countries. So I don't have much to say on South America. And
then our colleagues in China, anything from there? Because I mean, I think if there's growth, they're the world's engine at the moment, but they have got issues.
Yeah, the issue with China currently right now is that they have adopted a zero COVID policy. A chart that I love to look at or love to create is looking at the global commercial flights, right? These are people that travel around the world. During the pandemic, you could see like only 2-3 planes flying around the world. Now it's hundreds and thousands of planes flying around the world. And that's a gauge as to how many people are traveling around the world and how many economies are therefore opening up, which is good for consumer confidence and so forth. Now, what we're seeing with China, as respective economies are opening up their borders, are trading more, businesses are opening up again, people are going to work. With China, we've seen lockdowns in China and Shanghai, for example, and that has resulted in the manufacturing numbers to be quite weak when looking at the PMI figures, which is now sitting at 37 points. A PMI figure, anything above 50 suggests an expansion. Anything below 50 suggests a contraction. So what we're seeing in terms of services as well as manufacturing output in China is that we're seeing it being at a contractionary phase, largely due to the lockdowns that have been implemented. And this also brings the risk to economic performance in China, where we now are starting to see the test of the Communist Party of China, as well as how long are they going to follow through with the zero COVID policy, which is detrimental to their economic performance. So what we have at this CRA is that we have a weekly risk alert, which we flag risks in South Africa as well as around the world. And what we're closely monitoring is the relation between China and the US, where we could actually, if we continue to see lockdowns in China, we could therefore start to see a weakening in China economic performance to the point where it could be even weaker than the US, for example, which is going to be quite interesting because that hasn't happened in decades.
That's actually quite interesting there. And India is anything from India you see of interest?
Nothing of interest per se that I see from India. India is still I don't see much risk in terms of India, but therefore I need to also look at it in quite close detail. There are these other emerging themes that I look at in more detail compared to others. I don't look at India that much, but I should indeed, because India does have high levels of economic output as well. But I don't have anything much to say in regards to India.
All right. No. So I think with that, I think I enjoyed the tour de force, and maybe just brings us back to South Africa. Sometimes I think I always find that sometimes our news outlets it's either we go two extremes. We're either too inward focusing, or we adopt CNN policy and BBC without actually understanding the finer nuances, as you've touched on. And maybe I don't know if such a thing exists, maybe positive risk, which you think we could possibly go in the direction of to take advantage of what is a world in flux at the moment. Anything which you look at internationally and say, look, if we really were smart, we would be thinking about this.
That's a really good one. Risk analysts usually look at the negatives. They don't tend to look at much of the positives. But let's try and get the positives, right? The positive for South Africa has been the commodity rally that has boosted government revenues. However, whether that will last for the next 3 years, that does unfortunately seem unlikely due to what's happening with interest rates being hiked around the world, which results in commodity prices being weaker. But for now, it's looking good in terms of our terms of trade. In fact, S&P upgraded South Africa's fiscal outlook to positive, given our terms of trade as we're having net exports now. So that's a positive. What's another positive? I don't really see much, actually. What's another positive?
Dig in there, Bheki. Dig in. Give us something.
I need to dig in. I think another positive is also like kids going back to school, mostly full-time now. I think that's a huge positive compared to what happened during the pandemic. Most kids lost 50% of their school capacity. And that's not even touching on what happened in rural areas. It's very important for kids to go to school physically and see their teachers, because most schools don't have the facilities to do online coursework and so forth. Yeah. But also for the fact that it also gives parents the ability to also go to work. If your kid was not going to school because of lockdowns, you are also forced to therefore take care of your kid, whereas you're supposed to also be working. So that's a positive as well. It's a positive that South Africa is likely not to see much of the hard regulations that we saw in 2020, which would mean some level of recovery in some sectors, but not substantive enough for South Africa to grow at high levels, unfortunately. Yeah, those are the positive. I hope they.
No, I think it's a good way to
Yeah.
sort of almost put the come to the end of it, because I think it's good that I always say that we try to build on, help the policymakers, like you say, to kind of get out of the quagmires they tend to be in. No, I think we've now come to the part of the show where we ask you, Bheki, maybe 3 things, books you're reading, things which currently just pique your interest even outside your field, any books you'd like to suggest, or anything, reports which are keeping you busy?
The first book I'd like to recommend for people comes from my mentor, The Rise or Fall of South Africa. This was written by one of the greatest minds in the country, I believe, Dr. Frans Kania. And it is essentially looking at the history of South Africa, looking at social economic standing of South Africa, and tries to draw a story as to where would South Africa lead in the coming years. So this is the book that I'm refreshing my memory on. I read it just before it came out, as I was also working on the data that was used in this book. And also, I'm flexing now, but I'm also credited in this book as well.
No, so that's a positive for you guys.
Yeah, so just to reiterate, it's the rise or fall of South Africa, and that is definitely important. It's not saying the rise and fall, we could either rise or we could either fall. And I believe it's really telling, and it would really be interesting to see what happens in the 2024 elections, where South Africa could see high levels of economic performance or lower levels of economic performance. What was your second question? Sorry, besides
anything of interest, which maybe you're just focusing on for the sake of,
Yeah, another point. Yeah, sorry. Another point of interest that I'm really touching on is inflation. So the thing is that unfortunately, economists talk about inflation once they see it in their faces, not about when it was in the back end, once you started seeing these massive stimulus levels being implemented in each respective economy and so forth. But I've largely been trying to be consistent in the thought of inflation, as well as the consequences that it has in society. That's one aspect. Also having a look at what might happen to the rand, for example, that massively devaluated. It was sitting at 14 rands to the dollar now about a month ago. Now it's sitting at 16 rands to the dollar. That's another risk. What's happening with fuel prices, that's what I'm also closely monitoring. Yeah, but anecdotally trying to think more by walking more, just trying to be active. A lot of people are back at their offices, but we don't have offices anymore. So we're mostly confined in our living spaces, but I'm trying to be active just a little bit more, just walk for that 30 minutes, an hour. That's what I'm doing personally.
No, that's good stuff. Like I always say, Sam, we all had to shed that, we call it, what is it, the lockdown weight, which is not a positive.
Yeah,
which is not a positive. But Bheki Mahlobo, thanks so much actually for joining us. We hope to have you more on the TK show. I know you're a friend of the channel, or the broader channel. So thanks for having us. Really enjoyed the conversation, and we'll touch base probably closer to the ANC conference to see
for sure. There's a lot of stuff that we can still talk about. What am I thinking of the ANC conference? What are the likely outcomes? I'd love to chat with you more. Thank you so much for having me on, TK. I really appreciate this, and love to do this again.
No, thank you. And just to our audience, thank you for just tuning in again. We always try to bring, I think, critical thinkers to our platform, and also not just critical, but people actually are answering what I think Bheki will appreciate, the bread and butter questions which South Africans really want answered, which is we want bread and we want butter on our tables. And thank you for actually just really putting that on the table, Bheki, and we wish you well, and you will be coming back for sure.
Thank you so much.
If you enjoyed this conversation, please subscribe to our YouTube channel and rate us on all your preferred podcast platforms. If you'd like to find out more about what we're doing, please join our Substack community via the link in the comments below. And as always, we'd love to hear your suggestions for future guests and conversation topics.